Hello, I would like to welcome all participants to our today's webinar. My name is Leila Hakimizadeh and I'm Senior Planning Advisor with OPR. OPR is excited to host this webinar and introduce you to wildfire resources we recently released. I would like to acknowledge the work of my former supervisor, Eric Dickock, who was the project manager for these wildfire planning projects, and Beth Hotchkiss and other OPR employees for their significant contributions. Today, we are also joined by staff from CAL FIRE, the Board of Forestry and Fire Protection, and the Community Wildfire Planning Center, who are close collaborators in this work. Now I'm going to introduce the agenda. So for our today agenda, we have the context setting, fire hazard planning technical advisory, wildfire urban, which we call them WUI planning guide, additional resources and questions and answers. Next slide. So in this slide, I'm going to instruct you how to use the Q&A feature. You can ask questions at any time during this webinar by using the Zoom Q&A function. You can also upload questions that you see have already been answered. Staff will be responding to the questions throughout the webinar. Next slide. So we're just in the context settings section. So I'm going to provide a brief history of wildfire in California. To begin, it's important to understand that wildfire is not new to California. Many species within the states are adapted to wildfire, and for generations, California Native American tribes have used fire to enhance landscapes and protect cultural resources. Wildfire is important to California ecosystems and people because it reduces overgrowth and helps maintain biodiversity. In the 1800s, however, wildfire cycles were disrupted when the government passed a series of laws to suppress wildfire. As a result, during the past century, vegetation started to build up, creating fuel for future wildlife, and ecosystem health deteriorated. Though agencies began to recognize the value of wildfire and shift their policies in the 1970s, the impact of prior actions are still felt today. In addition, climate change is now exacerbating the hazard and risk the communities are facing. Hotter temperatures and shift in precipitation have made fire seasons longer and more severe. This compounding impact have set the stage for recent catastrophic wildfires and will continue to pose challenges into the future. Today, we must adapt to these changing conditions. Notably, planners must now address wildfire and climate changes in their general plans. Next slide. So due to population growth and overdevelopment pressure, we've expanded the footprint of where we live. Today, nearly 1/3 of the homes in California are built within or adjacent to wildfire areas. In what we call the Wildfire-Urban Interface or WUI. About 11 million Californians call WUI home. These areas are important because they have greater exposure to wildfire and are at higher risks. Over the past decade, we've seen unprecedented loss of life and property in the WUI areas. This brings us to the question that what does it take to make communities, particularly those in the WUI, fire adapted and more resilient? Next slide. So it takes us to the opportunities that we have. We know that wildfire risk can be reduced through land use planning and implementation. Community scale action can protect climate vulnerable communities, and it's possible to learn from the past to build resilience moving forward. And I'm going to highlight how the state is taking action. The state now has a comprehensive strategy to help communities adapt to wildfire. It's called California's Wildfire and Forest Resilient Action Plan. The plan has 4 goals. Goal 2 focuses, that is just mentioned here, focuses on strengthening the protection of communities and include 32 distinct actions. For example, Action 2.4 and Action 2.5 highlight OPR's efforts to update its fire hazard technical advisory and develop a WUI best practice inventory. We recently completed both actions and are excited to introduce you to these resources we developed, and we're hoping that this will help communities become fire adapted. Next step. I'm also going to have a brief introduction of how to use these documents. So for the OPR fire hazard planning technical advisory, it helps communities develop long-range planning policies and programs for their general plan to address wildfire risk at the community scale. This document was designed as a process guidance and is best to read from A to Z. It also requires some time to digest. The other document, which is OPR's WUI Planning Guide, complements the technical advisory that I just mentioned by helping communities leverage a variety of planning tools to support the implementation. This document was designed to be a choose-your-own-adventure document, so users can jump between the content based on their interests and their needs. As a result, it can be helpful for folks who are on short time frames. Next slide. At this time, we will take a deeper dive into the fire hazard planning technical advisory, which helps communities develop long-range policies and programs for their general plan to address wildfire risks at the community scale. Now I'm going to pass it off to Claire McCoy, a wildfire planning specialist at the Board of Forestry and Fire Protection.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Leila, for that introduction. It's nice to see you all. As Leila said, I'm the wildfire planning specialist at the board, meaning I coordinate the board's review of safety elements. So I will chat a little bit about the general plan and what wildfire planning looks like in the context of a safety element update. So this slide shows the various required elements that comprise the general plan. You can see a lot of these, potentially have intersections with wildfire planning, environmental justice, air quality. All of these green elements are required. There are other optional elements that can cover things like historical preservation or climate resilience, but the bulk of wildfire planning falls under the umbrella of the safety element, which we can get into in the next slide. So Senate Bill 1241 in 2012 amended the government code to require that jurisdictions in either a state responsibility area or a local responsibility area that contains a very high fire hazard severity zone, upon the next update of the housing element of their general plan, are also required to update their safety element. And in doing so, to meet certain requirements for wildfire hazard planning. That requirement took effect back in 2014. So the board is required to review the updated draft of a safety element, and we have a land use planning staff that will work with those jurisdictions, either containing very high fire hazard severity zone in the context of a city or local jurisdiction, or a county that's located in SRA, to meet those wildfire planning requirements in the safety element, for things like land use and critical infrastructure, and how you're developing in relation to the wildfire hazard risk in that community. So in addition to that sort of basic baseline requirement from 2014, there have been a couple more recent requirements. One being also triggered by the housing element, that starting in 2020, the government code was updated to include that the safety element needs to identify residential developments that do not include at least 2 emergency evacuation routes that are located in any hazard area, so including but not limited to wildfire. There's an additional requirement that just took effect this year in 2022 that upon the next revision of the local hazard mitigation plan, there's some further identification and analysis of evacuation routes that's required, both for wildfire and other hazards. And that can be done in the safety element or in the local hazard mitigation plan and incorporated by reference into the safety element. So that's a lot of information and can be a little difficult to parse at first, but the CAL FIRE's land use planning staff, again, works really closely with jurisdictions throughout the process of these safety element updates, and they're familiar with all of the requirements that have been in place. And so through that process, by the time your safety element comes to the board for formal review at the Resource Protection Committee meetings of the board, which happen every 4 to 6 weeks or so, in most cases, the safety element is mostly, has mostly been updated in a way that's already compliant with those requirements. And the board review is sort of the final step in the process before that element is ready to be adopted by the jurisdiction. And I think that's all I had in terms of a quick overview of wildfire in the safety element. And I will pass it back to, sorry, I'm not sure who has the next slide, but I'll pass it back to Leila.
It'll go to me. That's fine. Thank you so much. So I'm going to go back a slide. Oops. Okay. Yeah. So in response to the wildfire requirements that Claire mentioned, OPR first developed a fire hazard planning technical advisory in 2018. And now in 2022, we have updated that guidance, and we did this in response to SB 901 as well as AB 2911, which required OPR to include specific land use strategies to reduce fire risk to buildings, infrastructure, and communities. And in addition, we wanted to provide this guidance to help agencies conduct outreach, assess wildfire hazards and risks, align general plan activities, and develop policies and programs. So back starting in 2020, we followed a 4-step process. First, we conducted research for this technical advisory where we interviewed experts and also convened a state interagency working group. And this helped us better understand the latest data and inform our thinking with regard to the technical advisory. And then afterward, we developed a draft for review. And during this public comment period, we did a webinar and conducted several briefings. Then OPR revised the TA in response to the comments received. And now we've released this final TA, which we're going to be doing more outreach on and also providing ongoing support as needed with the contents of the technical advisory. And OPR is going to update this document at least once every 8 years in order to keep the information current. So this is a great resource. So what's in this document? As mentioned earlier, this TA was designed as process guidance and it's best read from top down. The first part of this technical advisory contains an overview as well as regulations. So this background information is helpful for communities to understand how wildfires is impacting Californians and also understand the key policies that are in place with regard to wildfire planning, as well as some of those evacuation planning requirements Claire mentioned. The next part of the TA also contains planning guidance, which is really the bulk of this guidance, and it's really the heart here. In this section, we walk readers through different steps of the planning process, all the way from community engagement down to policy development. And it's important to note here that OPR does not have any regulatory powers, so we aren't going to be enforcing any of these recommendations, but these recommendations are there as a service to the public and to help readers meet those requirements. And so finally, the last part of the technical advisory also includes example policies and resources. And this content can be referenced by local agencies, and examples may also be modified based on what's most appropriate for all the communities. And our intent here was to provide additional information that could support the general plan development and implementation with regard to wildfires. So going into more detail regarding that planning guidance part, outlined here are some key concepts that are introduced in the technical advisory. First, for community engagement, OPR recommends that agencies engage their communities early and often. Agencies should make sure that a diverse set of voices are included within the general plan process, and this can include tribal governments, residents, as well as fire safe councils, and also populations that are most vulnerable to wildfire. This engagement process should empower all of the different stakeholders so that they can influence the general plan. And this part of the planning process I'm really stressing right now because it can really help with reducing the duplication of efforts and also lead to more thoughtful policies and programs. The next sections of the technical advisory help communities identify hazards and risks. Hazard identification is all about understanding the potential intensity and likelihood of wildfires occurring in the community. And for this section, OPR provides a lot of potential data and resources communities can reference to understand wildfire hazards in their area, as well as other related hazards. Meanwhile, risk focuses on the potential for wildfires to cause harm. And so within the risk assessment section, this is where OPR helps communities identify the different populations, infrastructure, as well as ecosystems that could be harmed by potential wildfires. Also within this section, we wanted to highlight an opportunity for communities to align their wildfire risk assessment with all of the different environmental justice and climate vulnerability efforts that might already be underway per SB 379 as well as SP 1000. After communities identify their hazards and risks, that's when they can begin to think through different planning solutions. So within our technical advisory, OPR encourages communities to use a holistic planning approach, looking not only at the safety element, but also the other general plan elements, including housing, transportation, and conservation. And within this framework, communities should weigh the different costs and benefits of solutions, making sure not only to look at the direct impacts of a potential wildfire solution, but also the secondary impacts on each of their community goals. And as part of the technical advisory, OPR provides specific guidance related to the land use element in a section called the land use alternatives analysis. And this element is of particular interest because it presents a unique opportunity for communities to build resilience upstream in the planning process. And within the alternatives analysis section, OPR outlines two different approaches for communities to consider, both avoidance as well as risk minimization. An example of avoidance would be if a community decides not to allow certain land uses in an area that's subject to extreme wildfire threat, while risk minimization is more about helping communities incorporate risk reduction measures to be more resilient in a hazardous area. So OPR asks that agencies choose an approach that best protects their communities from unreasonable risk and aligns with their community goals. And then once communities have decided on a strategy, they can then begin to develop policies and programs to help them reach those goals. And the policies and programs should be developed in a way where they align with all of the other general plan elements. And they can also align the general plan itself with other plans, such as local hazard mitigation plans or community wildfire protection plans. So going back now, I mentioned that we had a big public comment period. So within that public comment, we received 33 letters regarding the technical advisory. And in those comments, certain themes emerged regarding the land use alternatives section, policy development, and hazard identification. So within the land use alternatives section, we heard that commenters felt that the draft set a preference for avoidance over risk minimization, and they expressed that this could create barriers for housing development. So we definitely heard that in the public comment period when our draft was out. We also heard commenters felt that the technical advisory should address regulatory challenges such as increased housing pressures, as well as scaling up vegetation management activities. And then lastly, related to hazard identification, commenters wanted the technical advisory to address additional hazards such as wildfire smoke and post-fire landslides and flooding. So in this draft that we recently released, you'll see that we made a lot of changes in response to these comments. And these changes are in this final version that we just published. Within the land use alternative section, you'll see that OPR clarified that both avoidance and risk minimization can both be effective land use strategies. And we ensured that the technical advisory didn't give a preference to either alternative, and it's really for communities to decide. Related to policy development, OPR also encourages local agencies to consider no net loss policies as complementary to avoidance in order to better align with our housing goals. In addition, we included more local planning approaches to support vegetation management, such as leveraging the Cal VTP program or programmatic EIR to scale up those vegetation activities. And then finally, with regard to hazard identification, you'll see that the final draft also includes additional languages and examples highlighting the impacts of wildfire smoke as well as other wildfire-related hazards. So at this time, feel free to put your questions about the technical advisory in the chat, and I will pass it back to Layla, who's going to introduce the other resource we have, which is our WUI planning guide.
Thanks, Beth. So now we will dive into the WUI planning guide. This resource complements the Fire Hazard Planning TA by helping communities leverage a variety of planning tools to support implementation. Next slide. This guide was initiated with California's Budget Act of 2019 appropriated funding to CAL FIRE. As part of that appropriation, funds were earmarked for OPR to inventory and publish best practices reflected in local planning ordinances and enforcement practices undertaken at the local level in the Wildland-Urban Interface. This project is part of California Climate Investments Initiative. Next slide. For this project, OPR worked closely with CAL FIRE and Board of Forestry and Fire Protection. OPR also contracted with the Community Wildfire Planning Center to lead the development of the WUI planning guide. Now I'm going to pass it off to Molly Maury, I hope I'm just pronouncing your last name correct, the director of CWPC, to go into more detail.
Thanks, Layla. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Molly Maury, and I am the executive director of our nonprofit organization, Community Wildfire Planning Center, or CWPC. So we work closely with local, state, and federal government agencies and other organizations. And as Layla said, we were selected last year through a competitive process to work with OPR and CAL FIRE and the Board of Forestry and Fire Protection to lead the research and development of the WUI planning guide. Next slide. So our work began last summer and was completed earlier this year. So it was about a year-long process. And when we began the project, we collectively, the entire team, had a general vision for how to create a set of case studies that illustrated WUI planning best practices. But first, we had to think about a few key questions, which boiled down to how exactly do you define what is a best practice for planning in the wildland-urban interface? And then secondly, how do you identify where these best practices are across a state as diverse as California? So sometimes best practices default to, well, we knew about it and it sounded good. I'm simplifying this, of course, but I think the point is we wanted to come up with a transparent strategy. So if someone asked, what made this a best practice, we could really explain it and create a helpful evaluation system that backed our selection process. There wasn't or isn't any precedent in the wildfire or planning fields to look at a set of best practices or best practice criteria in the WUI. So we started looking at several other examples in the sustainable development field and other fields, which helped us consider certain categories that could help us define what a best practice really is. Next slide. So we came up with 8 different categories that we could use to critically evaluate what makes a specific planning activity or tool a best practice for others to learn from. And the categories are relevancy. Does this actually relate to planning and development activities? So in other words, we weren't targeting landscape scale vegetation management plans or similar activities, which we know are important for the WUI, but those weren't the focus of our case studies. The primary focus. Efficiency, how many resources does this take? Is it done efficiently? Innovation, is there something novel about the way that this activity or planning tool was created or how it was implemented? The effectiveness would show if there was some way that a community measures or tracks progress on risk reduction, or is there some research to help evaluate the effectiveness of that particular planning tool? and the replicability. Can others do this? So it's great if it's novel and it's effective and it's efficient and relevant, but if no one else can do it, maybe we need to consider that piece as well. Equity, of course, how did the community consider disadvantaged or vulnerable populations in both the planning and the implementation of the tool? And then collaboration, who is engaged in the process, and sustainability. And by sustainability, we meant, can this effort be sustained in the future? Or was it just a one-time activity that, was linked so closely to a specific fund or resource that it could not be sustained for the future? Next slide. So we did an initial inventory of many different planning tools to generally understand what was out there, what are people using, what are communities using. We looked for a variety of tools in terms of general plans, master plans, community wildfire protection plans, development codes, subdivision regulations, overlay zones, assessment districts, and other types of tools that either address wildfire through policy and regulations or other mechanisms, or vice versa, baked in land use planning into a wildfire-oriented plan, such as a community wildfire protection plan. So, trying to integrate and connect these two activities together. Our inventory was based on a literature review. We looked at any other existing and similar case studies or other literature that featured examples in the WUI. We also looked through, or we did an online online search of tribal nations, counties with state responsibility areas and local responsibility areas, or areas in CAL FIRE's defined very high fire hazard severity zone. So we conducted a follow-up survey after we did our initial research with planning and fire practitioners. And this was also designed to ask questions that focused on what communities are doing to address wildfire risk in their jurisdictions, and requested examples of, what are you aware of who is doing, quote, good WUI planning in their jurisdiction. Some of you may have responded to that survey, and thank you if you did. So next slide. The goal of all of these activities was to cast a really wide net to get a broad sense of what communities were doing, what stood out from our research and our online review and the survey, and which communities we could ultimately follow up with and conduct interviews. So we started with about 53 communities of interest, and ultimately we narrowed that down to 14 communities that we interviewed. And then from that, we selected 9 communities based on a consistent rating system that tied back to that evaluation criteria that I just reviewed. And those 9 communities are the best practice case studies. Next slide. So here's a geographic look at the 9 communities that were selected, and you can see that there's many different types of planning tools that we profiled in the case study. In the case studies, each community is linked primarily to one tool, like a fire protection plan or a landscape ordinance. But then there's sometimes were some secondary tools that we mentioned, because really we know that these tools work in a broader constellation of efforts. It's not just simply one tool as everything that a community does. But for our purposes, we really wanted to dig in and highlight what that community was doing and what that tool really was designed to do. So for example, one of the case studies is Orange County, and we highlight their ranch plan fire protection program. And the evaluation criteria areas where this community example excelled were in relevancy, innovation, effectiveness, equity, collaboration, and sustainability. So they didn't have to be perfect in every single category, but we had to at least know that they were excelling in 3 or more of those evaluation categories that we identified. And I also want to note that there are certainly other best practices outside of these 9 case studies, but we are confident in this process that we created, that this was a very clear and transparent analysis for us to showcase what we considered a best practice for others to learn from. Next slide. So if you haven't looked yet at the WUI planning guide, and we hope you do, or if you haven't looked at several of the case studies yet, you'll want to know that they follow a similar template. So this ensures that as you read through them, you're getting similar information from each of the communities. So for each case study, we describe what is it, what is the tool and how does it work? So for example, if it's a plan, what is it about the plan that relates to wildfire, or if it's an ordinance, what are the provisions of the ordinance that focus on wildfire? And then we also discussed how it's being implemented, the type of collaboration and engagement that occurs, what type of innovations the community may have made, any relevant funding sources, and any other additional considerations. Next slide. So, and if you have downloaded the WUI Planning Guide, you'll see that it is much more than just the 9 case studies. We thought it would be very helpful to nest the case studies within a larger guide that outlines many of the planning tools that are available to communities when considering how they can reduce risk in the WUI in California. So we compiled a set of plans, regulations, and other tools that relate to the WUI. Not all of these are under the direct purview of land use planners, such as fire codes, but we thought it would be useful for any reader to see the larger set of tools available that generally relate to land use planning in the WUI, and to also complement the technical advisory in the sense that it extends beyond the general plan requirements and examples. Throughout the guide, we also sprinkled in brief community examples, which are just usually links or mentions of communities doing a specific activity. Next slide. But it's really the 9 case studies that take that deep dive into helping readers see how some of these tools are working in action. And, on this final slide for me, I want to acknowledge how grateful we are for the time and the expertise from the communities we interviewed. As a planner that has focused my career on wildfire planning, I was really, and we all were from our team, really appreciative of each community's willingness to share their experiences for the benefit of this guide and for others to learn from. So I think these case studies really show how much effort and collaboration and also long-term dedication that WUI planning activities require to be successful. So I will turn it back to, I think, Layla after this. Thank you.
Yeah, I will take this one. So right now, thank you, Molly, again for providing an overview of the WUI Planning Guide. And I also wanted to note that we have additional resources that are coming out for communities to look at. And these will be published in 2023 and beyond. So they're not quite ready, but we wanted to also preview that there's a lot of additional work that's happening and that will be continuing to happen to support communities that are facing these wildfire hazards. So first off, at OPR, we have these wildfire plan alignment guides. And what we're doing is we're developing this suite of guides to help local and regional agencies increase coordination between their planning activities for both flood after fire as well as wildfire events. So these guides will be published and they'll help outline local plans and their respective requirements. They'll discuss strategies for aligning and leveraging different planning processes, and they'll also highlight relevant tools and guidance documents that can help with some of that larger plan alignment. And these guides will be published in 2023 in both an interactive online format as well as a print booklet format for communities on our adaptation clearinghouse here at OPR. And as Claire mentioned, there are new planning requirements that are related to wildfire, but a little bit different. These ones are SB 99, AB 747, and AB 1409, and all they do is address evacuations. So they require local governments to update their general plan safety element to identify residential developments and hazard areas with less than 2 evacuation routes. And they also require all local agencies to assess their evacuation routes and locations under a range of different emergency scenarios, including wildfire, but also going beyond that. So OPR is working on another technical advisory called our Evacuation Planning Technical Advisory, and we'll be publishing this for public comment at the end of 2022. And the final technical advisory we're hoping to publish in 2023 in the coming year. And I will also pass it off to the Board of Forestry and Fire Protection to talk about some of their state regs.
Thanks, Beth. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Edith Hannigan. I'm the Executive Officer at the California Board of Forestry and Fire Protection. One of the big programs that we have at the board, besides, of course, all the timber harvesting, is the state minimum fire safe regulations. These are regulations that set minimum standards for development in the state responsibility area and the local responsibility area of very high fire hazard disparity zones. We recently made amendments to those regulations as a result of changes to Public Resources Code after SB 901 was signed by the governor that required the board to establish standards for fuel breaks and green belts around communities and to preserve undeveloped ridgelines designated as strategic. So those amendments are currently being reviewed by the Office of Administrative Law, and we anticipate an effective date of January 1, 2023. Thanks, Beth.
Great. And then we'll also have our CAL FIRE partners speaking about their new trainings.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Matt Damon. I'm a Deputy Chief with the Land Use Planning Program with CAL FIRE and the Office of the State Fire Marshal. We're very excited to be talking about our local planner trainings that will be launched hopefully at the beginning of next year. The main target for those is going to be local planners, local building officials, and local fire officials with those objectives of expanding knowledge of a lot of the things that we've been talking about today, as well as regulations and various opportunities for further education. So we partnered with Molly's group, the Community Wildfire Planning Center, and look for those more information to come in the coming months. Thanks, Beth.
Thank you. And at this time, we're going to invite everyone who has joined us to ask some questions in the chat function. So you can find that at the bottom of the screen under the Q&A. Feel free to type in questions and then also upvote questions that you'd like to see answered, and we'll start working on that. So I see that an attendee asked, was SB 901 extended and when does it sunset? I do not know the answer to that, but we can get back to you on that. And then I also see kind of in the comment for that.
Beth, I think I can answer that if that's okay.
That's
I'm not aware of any specific provision of SB 901 that we talked about today that has a sunset date. I believe like I said, anything we've talked about today, there might be other provisions of SB 901 that have sunset dates, but anything that we talked about today that was as a result of SB 901 does not have a sunset.
Perfect. Thank you, Edith. And then this other question is also upvoted, and it's in a comment there. It says, what will be done in communities found to have less than 2 evacuation routes? I think this has to do with SB 99, which just requires that local agencies identify communities with less than 2 evacuation routes. As far as what will be done, I know that OPR is working on some guidance right now to help answer that question, and we'll be having that guidance published at the end of the year. There's definitely a wide variety of different emergency management strategies, as well as changes to the built environment that can be made as communities think long-term about evacuations in their area. But we'll provide that guidance to you later, and we would love to hear your comments as well on what you think should be done. Okay, so I also see another question written by Terrence Washington. He asked, what is a strategic ridgeline? Would anyone like to answer this?
I'm happy to answer that I believe that's a question about the fire safe regulations and our proposed changes. So our proposal for the strategic ridgeline is that a local jurisdiction will identify strategic ridgelines to reduce fire risk and improve fire protection through an assessment of the following factors: topography, vegetation, proximity to any existing or proposed residential, commercial, or industrial land uses, construction where mass grading may significantly alter the topography, resulting in the elimination of ridgeline fire risks, the ability to support effective fire suppression, and other factors, if any, deemed relevant by the local jurisdiction. So that's how the local jurisdiction will identify strategic ridge lines.
All right, thank you, Edith. And I see a follow-up question to that too, asking if you could speak a bit more to the forthcoming requirements regarding fuel breaks and undeveloped ridgelines.
Certainly. So our requirements for fuel breaks are that when projects exceed a certain size or scale, the local jurisdiction has to determine if there's a need for a fuel break to protect that community. And then if a ridgeline is designated as strategic and that ridgeline is also undeveloped, so there's nothing constructed on it as of yet, then that ridgeline is supposed to be, or that ridgeline could be preserved as an undeveloped ridgeline, and residential units are not allowed on the ridgelines, and only like telecom facilities, storage group S or utility group U buildings will be allowed on that ridgeline to preserve it as a strategic undeveloped ridgeline.
Great, thank you. All right, this next question comes from Arlie Cassidy, and they ask, how should we make sure we know about the CAL FIRE planner trainings and know when the OPR and the Board of Forestry documents are released? Would Matt or Molly like to talk about the CAL FIRE planner trainings first?
Sure, I can take that really quickly. We will have a dedicated space on our website for this event. Communitywildfire.org is our website. We'll also be using the same channels we used to do our survey earlier this year for the WUI Best Practices Guide to share the announcement of when the trainings are officially launched. They will start at the end of January 2023, and we have 8 different training venue sites across the state. So hopefully there's one close to everyone's area who's interested in attending. So we're also working with APA California to get that information out when the venue, but when the venues are finalized. Matt, did you want to add anything else to that?
No, that very well said. That's very excited about that project with you, Molly.
Great, thank you so much. And then as to OPR announcements, all of those you can find through our listserv. If you go onto OPR's website, there'll be an option in the top corner called eList. You can register for OPR's different listservs, and we'll be posting the news there. In addition, you can follow us on LinkedIn as well as Twitter, but we'll also be sending out announcements related to upcoming wildfire resources, whether that's our plan alignment guides as well as our evacuation planning technical advisory.
Sorry, Beth, I also added our email training@communitywildfire.org, and I'll add that. I just responded to a question, but anyone who's interested in the trainings is welcome to send an email to that. Again, it's training@communitywildfire.org, and we can add you to the announcement list when the final dates are set for the trainings.
Great, thank you. Okay, I see a question at the top by Whitney Wilkinson. It says, will the TA for evacuation have specific guidance on how to assess capacity, safety, and viability of evacuation routes? And can you preview some of the guidance you are considering? And related, it seems like a difficult assessment for certain cities, especially when the guidance has yet to be released. So they're asking if the board is accepting fulfillment on this requirement through deferment, such as creating a policy to assess these within X amount of time. Okay, so yes, short story, the Office of Planning and Research will be providing specific guidance on how to assess capacity, safety, and viability of evacuation routes. And we're hoping to be providing that by the end of the year so that you can get started looking at the guidance and understanding some of the considerations. At this time for this webinar, I'm not going to preview that guidance, but if you wanted to send me an email with more specific questions, if you're getting stuck, I'm super happy to talk to you about this guidance and provide some technical assistance if you need it right now. And we'll be sharing an email up before the end of the webinar where you can contact us on that email as well. And then I don't know the answer to the question about the board and deferment. Would Claire or someone who reviews safety elements like to address that question?
Yeah, I'm sorry, can you just repeat what that specific portion of the question was?
Yeah, they asked, is the board accepting fulfillment on this requirement through deferment, such as creating a policy to assess these within X amount of time?
Oh, yeah, are you referring to the
Evacuation
first
requirement?
one? Yeah, that's fine, just to have that policy in the safety element right now.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. All right. And then at the top, there is a question from Ron, and he asks, is the underlying assumption that development will continue in the WUI in California? And are there any best practices to prevent new building in high-risk areas in the first place? Yeah, so this kind of goes back to one of the questions that we got asked a lot in our fire hazard TA about avoidance versus risk minimization. And so OPR's guidance, we don't set a preference for either strategy when it comes to land use alternatives, and it's up to the local jurisdictions to decide which route is best for them to take when it comes to development in the WUI and those fire-prone areas. But I suggest that you read that land use alternatives analysis section, and that can give you some ideas of how to approach this question. And it's also another thing I want to say is that you can also use a combination of strategies too, and it really depends on what the local jurisdiction wants to do and how they feel is best for their community in order to meet that bigger goal of the safety element, which is to reduce unreasonable risk. So all local agencies need to understand what is unreasonable in our area to do, and how can we make sure that our strategies, whether that be avoidance or risk minimization, how can we make those strategies in place so that we're really protecting safety while advancing some of those other community goals. And Amy did add a comment to saying to look at LA County safety element too if they want new language. All right. And then at the top, I see another question by Ada Marquez, and they ask, can these documents be used in CEQA, or do you have other resources for CEQA? So Ada, our document is mostly for general plan development, and we do talk a little bit about CEQA, but this isn't a CEQA technical advisory. So this one is really just focused on the general plan. I hope that answers your question. Okay. And then I see a question also from Michael Thayer, and they ask, is there a date for the release of the updated fire severity zones maps? Would anyone from CAL FIRE like to answer that question?
Yeah, I can give kind of a brief update to that. The release of the maps comes in two phases, first being the SRA phase, and then followed by LRA, so state responsibility area and then local responsibility area. Currently, the map data is being reviewed and evaluated by CAL FIRE units and the contract counties for SRA. And then that process should be forwarded for actual map adoption coming in the late fall or early winter. And then when that process is completed, then we'll move on to the LRA process. And so that should be next year.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, and then I see another question. This one's from Laura Russell, and they ask, is there a document that outlines the differences between the draft and final fire hazard planning TA? And you're underway with the safety element, and I want to make sure that nothing has changed that impacts you. The documents are substantially, they're pretty similar. And in terms of content changes, we don't have any document that outlines line by line the differences between the draft and the final version. But I would say that some of the more substantive changes happened in the land use alternatives section. That's where we talked about, reframed how we talk about avoidance and risk minimization. And it really broadened how we talked about it so that we made sure not to give preference for either strategy. And then in terms of other differences, we just added additional information. So it's not necessarily going to change the approach to your safety element. It's just additional information that folks asked us to provide. So I hopefully that answers your question. And if you have specific concerns, feel free to reach out to us over email, Laura. Thank you. Okay. And then I think we have time for a couple more questions. So I see one from Amy Bodek, and she asks, is there a list of standardized emergency scenarios for local jurisdictions to analyze under AB 747 and 1409? These are the evacuation requirements. And Amy, we're still working on this guidance. At this time, we don't have any standardized emergency scenarios. And I think a lot of those scenarios do depend on the local agency or the local jurisdiction and what hazards might apply there. So I think we can send you our evacuation technical advisory and you can take a look once that's released. But at this time, we don't have any standardized list. And then, let's see. Will OPR publish a map of wildfire assessment results in some or all counties and tribal nations? Maybe this is a question for the board and their safety element review.
As far as a map published of where safety elements the board has reviewed are coming from. Yeah, that's not something we have spatial data for. You know, we haven't visualized that in the form of a map. We have, you know, just records in the form of a spreadsheet, and that's, I don't think we have plans to put that in map form. But that's not to say it wouldn't be interesting and potentially useful to see. Hopefully I was understanding the question correctly. Edith, did you want to add?
Yeah, you know, the Board of Forestry and Fire Protection, we review safety elements and we make recommendations. We don't really, we do to a certain extent sort of assess the document, but I don't think there, I don't think we really produce the type of document that this person is asking about.
Yeah, it's not, the board doesn't play a decision-making role or take a vote that determines then whether the jurisdiction will be able to adopt their element. It's, you know, it's more of a review to provide some recommendations that there are then standards around, you know, the board can request a consultation if the jurisdiction chooses not to adopt those recommendations, but typically the recommendations, those are made in the process leading up to board review. And it's not, yeah, the board doesn't play a big decision-making role, and there's not like a narrative assessment document that comes out of that.
Great, thank you so much. So it looks like we have 5 minutes left, so I want to give us time to wrap up. But I do have all these questions in Zoom, and if there's questions that we didn't get to, we'll take a look and we can publish like a Q&A question and answer document at the end of this. And I'm also happy to respond after the webinar too via email. Okay, and I'm going to pass it off to Layla with just some closing information.
Okay, so I wanted to thank everyone for attending our webinar today. After leaving today's webinar, you should see a short 3-question survey appear in your browser. We encourage attendees to fill out this to help OPR improve our future outreach and webinar activities. For additional questions, attendees can contact OPR staff at wildfireTA@opr.ca.gov. We will publish these slides and recording on the same location in OPR website that they have published this document. I provided the links to this document in the Q&A, but please feel free to reach out to this email if you have any additional questions or we didn't have enough time to answer your questions. So with that, I want to thank everyone for joining us and wishing you well. Beth, do you have anything else to add?
Yeah, I think that's everything. Again, we appreciate everyone who's joined us for this webinar session. We really appreciate it. And if we haven't answered your question yet, or if there's additional questions that you have, again, please reach out to us at this email address and we'll work to get back to you as soon as possible. And then we also wanted to just leave a little bit of time for you all to fill out that survey that we mentioned so that we can just get feedback and better understand more of the questions that folks have related to wildfires. So yeah, thank you again, and we hope to see you in the future.